have no background in performing at all. I was never even in the school play. So it remains a mystery to me as to how I got in this business, except that I like to say that my Chautauqua career started in a way as a college student with a gunshot in the classroom. And I know that sounds very ominous, but my college instructor came in one day wearing a coat and tails and a top hat with a gun in his hand, and he managed to shoot a blank in the classroom, which startled us all, mesmerized and entranced us all. And then he proceeded to talk about John Wilkes Booth. So I will never forget the impact of seeing John Wilkes Booth walk into the classroom. So I was hooked. Later on, I went to a library program at my local library, and a small town library hosted Willa Cather. It wasn't, of course, Willa Cather, but it was someone portraying Willa Cather. And I was so enthralled by the idea that someone could portray Willa Cather convincingly, but even more, I was just enchanted by the fact that someone could answer questions as Willa Cather. Whatever question could be thrown at this woman, her name was Betty Jean Steinschauer, and she still does this work. I couldn't believe that she could answer those questions without missing a beat. So I kept thinking, wow, wouldn't it be interesting to do this kind of thing myself? And in a crazy moment, one wintry day, I got some papers from the National Endowment for the Arts, and they were looking for someone to create a project in education, and they were going to offer some funding. So I just recklessly filled out the form and said, I would like to be Emily Dickinson, and I would like to bring that portrayal to the classroom. And by golly, they funded it. So then I'm really stuck, right? I can't back out now. And from there, I began doing the research and the travel and so on and so on. And Emily Dickinson was the first character that I created. What impact has it had on my life? Well, just personally speaking, I have learned so much, not just information-wise, but presentation-wise. You know, I made every mistake that you can possibly make before I managed to do a good performance. So it has expanded my ability to learn, it has expanded my range of knowledge, and it has expanded my confidence in being able to stand in front of an audience and tell a story that people are interested in. I can't say enough about how that works in my life and how it would work in a young person's life too. I learned about mining and exploring primary source material. You know, students really don't get an opportunity to do that very often. It gave me confidence because I don't like to stand in front of people. And I know that sounds crazy. I'm more Emily Dickinson at heart than I am P.T. Barnum. So I could be in front of an audience because I wasn't really being myself. So that was the way it worked for me. I love learning, and this is a way to learn and use what I learn, make an impact on people's lives, and get applause at the end, and sometimes get a paycheck. It just doesn't get any better than that.
I think what I love about Chautauquans is we come from so many different places. My early experience is so much different than Debra's, and yet we ended up in almost the same exact place. So for me, I came out of the womb knowing that I wanted to tell stories. I don't know if it's in the Italian-American Sicilian blood. I suspect that it is. But I was acting at 8 years old. I wrote my first poem probably at 11 years old, my first novel, which was terrible, at 15 years old. I went to school and I double majored in theater and English literature. I mean, I just knew that I wanted to do this work. And I've been very blessed for 30 years to be a professional, to be a teaching artist, which I love. That's in the blood of Chautauquans too. We don't just perform, but we teach. It's in our nature. So for the first 20 years, I wrote stories and in all you almost name it, I've done it. Musicals and screenplays and stage plays, novels, poems, short stories. If it's a mode of telling story, I want to learn how to do it well. Audio drama, I'm very into now. I knew instinctively that in order to really understand our craft, you have to understand all the parts and pieces. So I was a writer and I was an actor, but I needed to become a director so that I could understand the language of directors as a writer and as an actor. Then 10 years ago, and Debra, you may know her, Eileen Evans, who has Voices of the Earth. I was living in West Virginia around Morgantown, Fairmont, and I had done a Kennedy Center teaching artist workshop with Eileen. That's how I had met her. And she called me and she said, Joey, I do this thing called Chautauqua. And I said, I have no idea what that is, Eileen, but it sounds intriguing. So my first character was Captain Louis Emilio from the 54th Massachusetts. People may know him from the story Glory with Matthew Broderick. They were part of the U.S. Colored Troops. And that journey was just, I had loved the Civil War forever. But the idea of these men who wanted to fight for their country having to duck riots in the cities where the drafts were, having to get on trains in the middle of the night, how white officers didn't want to serve with them. They resigned their commissions, many of them, and they walked away. And Louis Emilio was a man who believed deeply in this project. So from there, as Debra said, I was hooked. Once you do Chautauqua, you're hooked. And it speaks to me as a teaching artist for the same reason Debra was talking about Willa Cather, the ability to know so much about this person that people could ask you any question. So after a year and a half or 2 years or 3 years of studying these people, you're like, yes, bring the questions, and let's see what we can do with them.
One of my characters is a Titanic survivor, a woman from Ohio who survived the Titanic. Edith Russell is her name. And someone in the audience asked if there were dogs on the Titanic. Well, I happen to know how many dogs there were on the Titanic and what kind of dogs there were and what happened to the dogs. And I remember there was a bit of audience buzz because they were surprised that I would know something so obscure. It was a good moment.
The best thing that we can do is tell the story through the person and as the scholar with as much truth as we can. When you do that, the audience takes the journey with you, and some very interesting things come out of it.
When I come out of character and the students are just dumbfounded because they thought I was really the character. And I remember once being in a school for troubled kids, and after I finished and came out of character, one big young man stood up and was just stomping and sort of waving his fist saying, I thought you were the real person. I thought you were the real person. Now I know that the whole tent thing is complicated. It's expensive. It may be going away because of those two reasons. It's also hot. People are not always happy to be sitting under a tent on a 90-degree day. But to me, that is just the best experience of all. Summer night, a crowd, families. You know, that's one of the things that is distinctive about Chautauqua, because whole families come together to learn. It's not just adults, or it's not just kids in a classroom, but it's the whole family and their friends, and you know, kids are playing Frisbee and then the show starts, and and there's ice cream sometimes, and everyone's having a good time. I do remember in Warren, Ohio, when I was with Ohio Chautauqua, and it was again my Titanic survivor character. And that is a story that people just don't get tired of. It's, as one scholar said, an unsinkable subject. It was a perfect night. And I walked out on stage, and there are 700 plus people spread out on this lawn. And I thought, this is what it feels like to be a rock star. Just as far as I could see, there were people. The bar was very high. It was an exhilarating night. And of course, I'm not saying that the only thrill comes from seeing a big crowd, because I've had a handful of people too who were just leaning into every word and were gracious enough to come up afterwards and talk about how what I had talked about in character was meaningful to them. There's a lot of benefits, small crowds, big crowds, but I really do love those outdoor venues. I like the summer nights in the big tent. That's perfect. In developing a character, you see the complexities of your character. And that's one of the things that we as adult Chautauquans learn as we're creating our portrayal, but that's such a value for young people to understand too. You know, Abraham Lincoln was a flawed man, and they can't necessarily convey that in a school lesson, but a Chautauquan can convey it, and a young person who's doing a portrayal of Abraham Lincoln is bound to make those kinds of discoveries.
I got very interested in the Civil War. I came down to Georgia. I fell in love with the whole idea of the Battle of Atlanta. Romanticized William Tecumseh Sherman. You know, he hated journalists and this and that and scorched earth. And I read his autobiography and Ulysses S. Grant and said, these men were failures at everything they did in life. And boy, they tried a lot. The only thing that they were good at was total warfare. I have a lot of plays out there, but I write them so that children, young people understand that we understand the complexity of decisions. It's not just say no to drugs, say no to this, that, and the other. Oh, you know, you should never have a dark thought because you're a young person. You should always be up happy. And when we disperse those illusions and we say even the quote unquote greatest people in history cried themselves to sleep, had moments of regret, didn't know which way to go, made mistakes, almost didn't see it through or didn't see it through places in their life. I think that inspires a great deal of hope. I want the students to know that I'm a human. That opens dialogue. I'm in enough of a position of authority just because of our societal structure. But we're, you know, Debra, we're artists, we're educators, and we want to be, best advice I ever got was go where they are and bring them back with you.
You know, when you were talking, Debra, about Lincoln, we had at one of our Chautauqua, you know, lecture series events, a gentleman from Rutgers, a professor who's written a number of books on Lincoln. And, you know, at the end of his, you know, sweep of revealing the flawed and the brilliant about him, he said, you know, the thing that I love most of all about President Lincoln was that he could change his mind.
Yes, he evolved. We need to understand that's part of what we do as humans. We get smarter, we learn. When you know better, you do better.
In technical terms, that's the arc. That's the arc of the character. And if the character doesn't have an arc, everybody has an arc. When we're talking about historical, you know, stage-worthy, Chautauqua-worthy characters, we're missing it. So we have to find it. It took me a really long time to find the right starting place for Che. And once I found that moment, that decision moment for, and his life was a series of decision moments. And so I approach all characters now from the point, what are the key decision moments? His decision to become a doctor when he was a terrible student was because his abuela, his grandmother, died of asthma. Now he had asthma, severe to the point where he would be bedridden. And he was so tough and wanted to overcome it. He would play soccer and do all these things that were dangerous to his health. But when his abuela died, he said, I have to become a doctor. And then when he went out on his famous motorcycle tour with his friend Albert, and saw the mining conditions and the conditions of the peasants and the thumb of the government and the thumb of foreign governments in America and the United Fruit Company, he said, there are other kinds of disease. There's social disease, there's political disease, and I can't fight this as a doctor. And that's why he adopted, and when he adopted socialism. And then it locked in during a battle in Cuba where he had to choose between a box of bullets and a box of bandages. And he chose the bullets. So I think unfolding decision moments, especially for middle school, high school kids, it's all about decision moments. We've been locked away for 14 months that have profoundly changed history, politics, social, everything that we deal with, economics, right? The intelligence community just came out with a report and they said the world is going to be in turmoil, new kinds of turmoil for decades because of what has happened in economic collapse and all this kind of stuff. You have these great divides. You have the alt-right and Black Lives Matter. You have all these different layers. And some people are being forced to retire their characters. And I don't know about that. I don't know about that because our job is to show who they were at that time in the evolution of the world. So it becomes good news, bad news. And that's another part of Chautauqua that I'm very interested and keen on. Where have we gone? How far have we come? Let's celebrate that. But then we have to pause and go, why does this sound so familiar to us? Why is this creeping up? Why haven't we learned these lessons? And how can we watch these people's mistakes? That to me is the primary value of Chautauqua right now, where we're at.
One of my characters is Margaret Mitchell, who wrote Gone with the Wind. And that novel and movie are under attack for a lot of very good reasons. But people also don't realize that Margaret Mitchell funded scholarships for African American medical students, and that money still sustains those scholarships. She also created a special emergency room at Grady Memorial Hospital in Atlanta to serve the African American people when they were not welcome at the regular hospital. So I like to be able to show that there's more to this story than what people immediately understand.
I read lots and lots of things that I disagree with. You know, I'll watch QAnon videos and break them down into a 3-act play and go, oh, or it's like a magic trick, right? The Prestige, the 3 parts. And you can track how they do this. We'll start in history, we'll stretch history, we'll get into the incredulous, but now I've got you wound up. Now I'm going to make an ask of you in your vulnerable place. So we need to learn these things. I just reviewed a great book. I highly recommend it. It's called Hannah's War by Jane Eliasberg. Jane's a Yale drama graduate, Woodrow Wilson MFA program in writing, directed all my favorite TV shows over the years. But it's based on Lee Meitner, the director, the physicist who actually invented nuclear fission with her partner who got the new Nobel Prize, and she did it. So anyway, Hannah is a fictitious version of her. But at the end of the day, it brings up a lot of interesting things. You were talking about Churchill. America seems to own the moral high ground of World War II, right? We have such clear villains, and we were the heroes, and Rosie the Riveter and all. Ships, at least one ship full of Jews, came to America and was turned away and was sent back to Germany. And it's kind of an unpopular opinion, though it's gaining, but Japan was on its knees. The dropping of the atomic bomb was to send a message to Russia. It had nothing to do with Japan. Japan was ready to. So works like that, works that we do, are so important to go, let's not adopt a moral high ground position because it doesn't exist. It doesn't exist. And that's okay, because that's dialogue.